Please join me in a really warm virtual welcome for Dr. Belinda Campos. Thank you, Belinda.
Thank you so much, Charlene, for that lovely introduction. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull up my share screen so that we're all in the same place. And I just want to say that it's a pleasure to be here with you today. As you heard, I'm going to be talking to you today about my research program that studies the cultural shaping of relationships. So I study cultural processes that shape high quality relationships, relationships that are marked by affiliation and cooperation, and the implications that those relationships can have for health. And in sharing some of this work with you today, I hope to get us all thinking about the possibilities that culture has for relationships, and that Latino culture, the culture of a people who have been historically stigmatized in the United States, might be a good thing to have or to be near. So let's start with this. If you ask people what is the most important thing in their lives, it's their social relationships that are invariably at the top of the list. And that priority has a sound basis. When our social relationships go well, when they're characterized by affiliation, cooperation, and a certain level of selflessness, they can enhance the quality of our lives by conferring higher levels of subjective well-being, of happiness, greater resilience in times of personal difficulty, and better health. Psychological scientists know that managing our relationships, though, in order to obtain those benefits of cooperation and affiliation, it's a complex process, and it's informed by many factors, including the cultural factors that I'm going to be talking about today. So I want to start a little bit with some exemplars of the kinds of relationships that I'm talking about. Here we have Roberto Gómez Bolaños and Florinda Mesa. They are instantly recognizable to you if you know the slightest bit about popular Mexican culture of the last 50 to 60 years. They are super famous comedians. They had a challenging but long-lived love of more than 40 years. And he once declared in an interview, "Estaré con Florinda hasta que la muerte nos separe. I shall be with Florinda until death do us part." Although then he added, "or until Shakira starts returning my calls." I did say that they were comedians. Here is the famous Bichir family. They are this well-known family of Mexican actors who are known to be so tight-knit and so prolific that one year, the Mexican MTV Awards had a category called the best Bichir in a movie. The one at the top is Demian Bichir. You might recognize him from his Oscar-nominated performance in the 2001 film, A Better Life. If you haven't seen it, you should. I highly recommend it. He might be more recently also salient to you from his hit movie, Godzilla vs. Kong. So an example of family. And then you have enduring friendships, like that of Penelope Cruz and Salma Hayek, who famously found each other when they first came to Hollywood. These three, all in their own way, are examples of relationships characterized by affiliation and cooperation. And these exemplars are in line with research to date that has provided extensive evidence that culture influences how people form, maintain, and terminate their relationships with partners, with family, and with friends. So what is culture? What I want to make clear throughout this talk is that culture is this invisible web that underlies all human context and that saturates all human social life. So key definitions of culture emphasize that you can think about it as group-based solutions to the challenges of human social life. You can think about culture as the filter through which thoughts and behaviors pass as they're processed into our subjective experience. You can also think about culture as a social map that allows people to navigate through the rules, norms, and expectations of our respective societies. In relationships, culture exerts its effects by shaping how people think and feel and behave, and how people expect others to think and feel and behave, including in relationships. So really, if you think about it, one way to answer the question, what is culture, is by thinking about it as the information that one needs to skillfully navigate one's social environment, and that includes relationships. And for many of us, culture is experienced as that invisible assumption of what feels normal. So to wrap our heads around that invisible normal, let's start with the dominant cultural context of the US. A long tradition of Western European scholarly thinking has assumed that human social behavior is primarily driven by self-interest, by a focus on maximizing benefits to the self, even if those benefits come at the expense of others. So for example, the early and influential book by Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, emphasizes maximizing desire and personal gratification as a central human motivation. In the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud emphasized hedonic pleasure as a central human motivation. And in the latter half of the 20th century, Richard Dawkins used the metaphor of selfish genes to advance the view that genes are the basis of adaptive natural selection evolutionary processes. And now most recently, in the early part of the 21st century, Patricia Greenfield, a psychologist, has fascinating work showing that via public writing, the focus on the self has actually increased in the US throughout the 20th century. And this focus on self-interest, on placing priority in personal satisfaction, is now understood to really have leaked onto close relationships with partners, and most recently families, becoming spaces where, in the words of sociologist Stephanie Kuntz, have become interwoven with the search for personal growth and the pursuit of happiness in a way that they haven't always been in the past. So given this dominant context, it was a bit of a theoretical surprise that individual selflessness actually has relationship rewards, but a couple of classic studies really highlight this. Axelrod and colleagues laid out the rules for effective cooperation with their computerized tournaments back in the 1980s, and where they found that tit for tat, which as you can see, when person A always cooperates first and person B then responds by cooperating as well, when the cycle of cooperation is initiated and continues, that is really successful for cooperation. And as you can see from the visual, when somebody instead of cooperating defects, they no longer cooperate with you, this strategy is successful because then you stop cooperating with them. So you cooperate when others cooperate, you always cooperate first. And as you'll see over in line 4 or 5, when somebody then renews cooperation with you, you start cooperating with them again too. So that's what we humans call forgiveness outside of computerized tournaments. And tit for tat has consistently been found to be the most successful strategy for effective cooperation. Joan Silk and colleagues documented the importance of strong social bonds to the reproductive fitness in non-human primates early in the 21st century. The more social animals were the ones who were able to raise their offspring to be more likely to grow to have offspring themselves. And if that sounds familiar, it's now recognized that these theoretical surprises are quite consistent with what's observable in everyday life, that individuals can be observed prioritizing others before the self, whether it's giving our time to the hobbies of our loved ones rather than indulging ourselves by going to the aquarium with our children rather than spending the day at the spa, or perhaps being willing to look past one's own personal desires to celebrate another's triumph, perhaps putting away one's hope that a child is going to move back home after college as you go on to celebrate their graduation. All the way to some of the strongest acts of other interest, committing to a partner, foregoing alternatives, or caregiving in the context of great dependence, like with a child or an aging relative. This last image might be familiar to you. It went viral pretty recently. This is a 24-year-old son carrying his 67-year-old father on his back to take him to get the COVID-19 vaccine in the Brazilian Amazon. The doctors estimated that it must have taken 5 to 6 hours to complete the journey, and the son needed to get the shot as well. So one of the things that you'll notice is that a lot of this prioritizing of others before the self happens in family contexts, whether it's family by blood, the ones we are born into, or the families we choose, like for example, marriage partners. And this prioritizing others over the self, one thing that characterizes the non-dominant ethnic cultures of the United States are particular ways of understanding how close relationships, how family relationships should work. How much should we put others before the self? And the answer is oftentimes more than the dominant culture of the US has typically considered appropriate. And this is especially true for the folks that I study, people of Latino or Asian background in the United States, who over the last 60 years have seen great growth due to the recent waves of immigrants, and who bring to their new country and to their children their understanding of relationships that they consider the natural and desirable way to be. So Latino culture is what we call a collectivist culture, more of an emphasis on others before the self that emphasizes warm interpersonal relations. And US East Asian culture is also a collectivist culture, but one that emphasizes more the harmonious balance in important relationships, and is less shy of the experience of negative emotionality. Both, however, place an emphasis on family closeness, but again, in the context of either this warm, more positive emotional way of doing things, or this more balanced, harmonious way of doing things. And here I want to make sure that I'm going to say an important caveat that you might hear me say a couple of times. Obviously, not all members of these groups personally endorse these values or even necessarily want to live up to them, but we're going to think about them as cultural ideals that contain information about the shoulds of life. How should you be? What should you do? So most of my work focuses on US Latinos, so I want to focus on them for a little bit. US Latino culture, as I said, is a form of collectivism, and it is what my co-author Hee-Jung Kim and I called convivial collectivism in one of our papers. As with all forms of cultural collectivism, it is normative and socially approved to think about the self as interdependent with others, to emphasize warm, positive relationships in this particular form of collectivism, and to have a pleasant politeness that preserves the honor and the dignity of self and others. So I want to highlight a little bit about what that means. So the warm, positive interpersonal relations, this is the idea that interdependent relationships should be actively built and maintained via open and frequent positive emotion expression, regular social gathering, and this pleasant politeness in order to, preserve the dignity of others. So this is captured by three cultural values: simpatía, respeto, and familism. And together they make up this unique cultural context that is central and common to Latinos. Simpatía is that emphasis on creating and expressing emotional positivity and avoiding negativity, and to do that in the service of smooth and enjoyable social interaction. Respeto is a formal politeness that encourages civil discourse and the avoidance of topics that might cause discomfort because they're embarrassing, or they are conflict-provoking, or they might be considered vulgar. And then familism, the one I'm going to be talking a lot about today, is an importance placed on having family relationships that are characterized by closeness, support, and frequent face-to-face interaction, so that it's specific with family members, this desire for interaction. The cultural ideal is for there to be frequent positive emotional interaction that both affirms family bonds, but is also part of duty fulfillment. And again, I want to be clear that that part of fulfilling family obligations and providing support, it is a duty, but it is one that is expected to be emotionally positive and intrinsically rewarding. And again, this is not to say that all in-group members personally endorse these values or want to live up to them. It's more that these are cultural ideals that contain information about the shoulds in life. And we cannot talk about US Latinos without acknowledging that this is a group that suffers from a great deal of hardship, including the realities of a stigmatized and devalued identity. So 27% of the US Latino population suffers from poverty. We've also been among the groups that have suffered the greatest losses during the COVID-19 pandemic. We remain underrepresented in higher education. We are often devalued and viewed as less than others. And that's particularly true for those of us whose appearance and language saliently differ from European American norms. Only half of us are recent immigrants, but there's this widespread perception that these new Latinos threaten American identity and are a drain on US resources. So a stigmatized identity is also a fact of this context. The recent socio-political climate has been difficult, but it's also not new. Just over a decade ago, during a time of higher optimism that we were getting it right with having a multi-ethnic society, these things happened. This is a photo of the Harvard dissertation acceptance for one Jason Richwine. In a 2009 dissertation for a public policy doctorate at Harvard, Jason Richwine wrote that Hispanic immigrants generally had an IQ that was substantially lower than that of the white native population, and that the lower intelligence of Hispanic immigrants should be considered when drafting immigration policy. It made national news at a time when it was discovered because he was working at an influential think tank on issues of immigration policy. And here you have Sebastián de la Cruz. In 2013, when he was 11, he gave this wonderful performance of the US national anthem during an NBA Finals game in San Antonio, Texas. He chose to wear his little mariachi outfit, not that different from what I see all the time at baseball games, memorials, and other events, especially in the Northeast, where a lot of musicians wear Scottish folk dress, kilts, and bagpipes. No one ever says a word about that. But the response to Sebastián's great performance was a social media outburst on Twitter of horrible racist comments. I'm going to spare you the details, but you can still Google Sebastián de la Cruz and see for yourself. Ironically, Sebastián is US born, and his father served in the US military. So a stigmatized identity is a fact of the US Latino context. And while we're laying out context, a side note on terminology, you're hearing me use the term US Latino culture, but who do I mean? Who are these folks? In the US, Latinos are broadly defined as people whose past includes a colonizing history with Spain and a mixing of Spanish with indigenous traditions, practices, and cultures, as well as the mixing with African, with Asian, and with Middle Eastern peoples. In short, some of everything. We're now the largest ethnic minority group in the United States. For example, here in California, half of babies born in our state as of 2003 were Latino. Historically, the US Latino population has been concentrated in the American Southwest, but that is no longer the case, and Latinos now have a presence throughout the entire US. This is a very heterogeneous population. There's many generational statuses represented, all the way from those of us who are very recently arrived to those of us who've been here since the lands were in Spanish hands. Many countries of origin are represented. Over 2/3 of the majority, over 2/3 are of Mexican heritage, but many, many other countries are represented too. We do not all speak Spanish. Many races and race mixtures are represented among us, but we are an ethnic group in the sense that we are, to varying degrees, distinguishably different from the majority. And that's the cultural piece that we're talking about today. So side note over. I was speaking of US Latino culture as a context of convivial collectivism and its cultural values, simpatía, respeto, and familism. So let's talk about familism. It's the cultural value I'm going to be focusing on today. So familism, as I said, really we should be thinking about these ideals of what families should be like. And the ideas of the shoulds of familism are that one should meet one's obligations to family, that one should see family as a first source of social support, and that one should have family as reference for decision-making, to take family opinions into consideration when you're making decisions about college or about a job or about anything else that's important, and that you should manage your behavior in a way that maintains family honor. And if you think about this, these values, this ideal, it's quite different from the ideals that are prevalent among US European Americans, which tend to emphasize more autonomy and separation, particularly in family relationships. And I should also mention, this is really important, that this construct had been, it's primarily studied in US Latinos, mostly of Mexican heritage, but it was originally studied as a source of deficit and as something that needed to be changed in order for Latinos to better themselves. So let's get to the specific studies I'm talking about today. I'm going to be focusing on my studies that highlight that these cultural values of convivial collectivism, familism specifically, are linked with psychological health, with romantic relationship quality in study 2, that they can enhance the impact of social support in study 3. And at the end, I'm going to finish with a study that suggests that being able to integrate one's cultural identities and feel that one's dual identities go together is also associated with psychological health and biomarkers that are relevant for physical health. So study 1, culture and physical health. So as I mentioned to you, so familism had originally been studied as something that was more of a deficit. And in this study, what we wanted to do is flip that script and really start to ask, is familism something that, because it sets the stage for positive relationships, could it be contributing to psychological health? And if it does, would it do so via the closeness and perceived social support that relationships can offer? So because familism is mostly studied in Latinos, we predicted that this pattern would be found in Latinos, and we explored whether the pattern extended to samples of East Asian and European background. So here is our hypothesized model. The idea that familism would contribute to better psychological health, not directly. It's not that you just have these values and this leads to something good. It's that you have these values and you're socialized into these values and the practices that go along with these values, and that sets the stage for you to feel greater closeness to family, for you to feel more support from family. And it's those relational processes that are then linked with the psychological health and the indicators of physical health. So in this hypothesized model, we're testing exactly for that familism would be related to greater closeness with family members, and therefore that closeness to family members would have us linked more with perceived support, and that it is that would then have a link to psychological health. So we had 1,245 participants in the study as they were asking this question. They were of Latino background, of European background, of Asian background. We recruited them here in Southern California. They filled out measures of demographics. We had 2 measures of familism because we wanted to make sure that we were really capturing the construct. We measured closeness to family members, parents and siblings. We had a measure of perceived social support and a measure of psychological health that brought together a measure of well-being, your happiness, as well as the extent to which you had symptoms of depression or other kinds of unhappiness. So the question that we were asking was, does familism contribute to better psychological health via closeness and perceived support? And to study this, we used structural equation modeling to understand the links across the data. What you need to know is that, as expected, this was exactly what we found, that this model that we had hypothesized, that familism would be linked to closeness, that closeness would be linked to support, and that support would be linked to indicators of psychological health. That was indeed the pattern that we found. And in case that you're curious, consistent with other findings in the literature, we found that Latinos had the highest levels of familism, but other people had high levels of familism too, and we can talk about that more towards the end. So for all 3 cultural background groups, the model fit well. There was no evidence of moderation, i.e. Latinos might have been higher in familism, but all members of our study, whether they were of Latino background, European background, or East Asian background, everybody who was higher in familism reported feeling closer to family and reported feeling more supported by family and reported higher levels of psychological health. So again, familism didn't predict directly to psychological health, but it did through relational processes. So what we learned from this study is that familism is linked to psychological health, and it is indirectly so through relationship processes, and that Latinos were highest in terms of familism, but that the cultural value appears to be relevant to other groups as well. So then I want to share with you another study where we were asking, well, to what extent does culture shape our romantic relationship quality? And romantic relationships are typically characterized by really high levels of interdependence, right? And they serve a special role as a primary source of closeness and support. Closeness and support are in fact indicators of high relationship quality. And when we think about, well, how do we think about romantic relationship quality? Romantic relationship quality is shaped by many factors, but that includes attachment factors, which if you understand to be those early family experiences where we are socialized into having stable expectations for whether people are going to be there for us when we're stressed or distressed. And also relevant is our sociocultural context, where interdependence, and specifically familism, is socialized, right? Where we learn to be comfortable with interdependence or to not be comfortable with interdependence. Are we going to be comfortable with relying on close others in a way that might be good for our romantic relationships in the future, or not so much? And so what we hypothesized was that familism would be associated with 1, higher romantic relationship quality, and 2, that would be explained by lower levels of avoidant attachment. So let me explain that to you for a little bit. So I said attachment avoidance is the stable orientation that reflects a discomfort with interdependence, right? A discomfort with relying on close others. You don't have expectations that others are going to be there for you in times of stress. And therefore, you think that the best bet is to maybe have a little bit of a distance. You're more comfortable with distance. Well, attachment avoidance is quite incongruent with cultural collectivism, which socializes us into being more comfortable with interdependence and with closeness with others. And so because familism is most often studied in Latinos, what we predicted from our pattern was that we would see the pattern whereby familism is linked with lower attachment avoidance in Latinos because of the cultural incongruence of it, and that attachment avoidance would be linked with partner support and with partner closeness, 2 indicators of romantic relationship quality. And again, I want you to notice in our hypothesized model that there is no thinking that just because you have these values that automatically something happens. It's that these values go along with behaviors and practices and et cetera that socialize different kinds of relational processes. So what did we think what did we find in the study? We had 521 participants of Latino background, of European background, of East Asian background. We had them complete measures of familism, attachment, perceived social support, perceived partner support specifically, and perceived closeness to partner. And then we examined whether the hypothesized pattern was indeed evident. And what we found is that the hypothesized pattern was indeed characteristic for the Latino sample, i.e. that familism, let's see if I can guide you through this, was correlated with less attachment avoidance. So the higher you were in familism, the lower you were likely to be in terms of attachment avoidance. And attachment avoidance, consistent with a lot of other findings in the literature, is associated with feeling less comfortable with partner support and less comfortable with partner closeness. So that altogether you have a pattern that suggests that familism makes you less likely to be avoidant, which makes you more likely to feel supported and close to partners. In this particular study, we did find that hypothesized pattern for the Latino sample. We did not find that pattern in the European and East Asian background samples. There were some indicators of associations with familism, but not the specific relational pattern that was hypothesized. And that's consistent with some of the newer research that is coming out of my lab and others that shows that Latino and East Asian forms of collectivism, they have things in common, but they are not the same. And this is a point that regularly shows up in my data. So the conclusions from the study are that familism is relevant for understanding the romantic relationship quality of Latinos. And there's no evidence that familism had similar links in the European American or in our Asian American samples. That moves us on to study 3. So in study 3, the one I want to share with you today is moving on to the question of, well, now that we're seeing evidence that these cultural values that emphasize putting others before the self can bring on some relationship benefits, seem to be linked with relational benefits, the next question is there a role for cultural values in enhancing the positive impact of social support, particularly in the context of acute stress? And here, I want you to think about how, well, as we've been talking about, relationships are health protective, right? Relationships that are emotionally supportive, that are close, that are embedded within strong social networks are understood to be health protective. Similarly, perceived social support, this general feeling that others are going to be there for you if you need them, this perception that one is valued and cared for and loved, and that you can count on close others to be there for you in times of distress. Well, that's robustly associated with more favorable coping that helps with stressful life events. So keep that in mind. And then in terms of physiological responses, we have cortisol reactivity. One physiological response that has implications for health, for future health, involves the stress hormone cortisol. Stress hormones, as a group, prepare individuals to respond to the challenges in their environments, right? And cortisol specifically is a stress hormone that is the end product of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, that is part of the body's neuroendocrine system. Overall, the HPA axis is stress responsive, and that means that cortisol increases in response to acute stress, and that increase is adaptive and healthy, and then it comes down. But the system of stress going up and stress coming down can become dysregulated. And chronic dysregulation of the body's stress systems can lead to stress-related disease. So the system, when it becomes dysregulated, the dysregulation typically takes the form of either exaggeratedly strong responses or blunted, flat responses that suggest that the system can no longer mount an adaptive and healthy response. Okay, so you put those two things together, you start to see that social support has been hypothesized to buffer the body's stress response systems, right? Scholars have theorized that the benefits of perceived social support should extend to the physiological responses that have implications for future health, including those that are experienced in response to acute psychosocial stress. However, studies assessing the physiological responses, in particular to laboratory stressors, have not always found that perceived support is beneficial. In fact, what you find is that although perceived social support has been theorized to buffer responses to acute stress, it has rarely been found to do so. And when you look at the literature as we did, you'll see that these previous studies that haven't really found that perceived social support buffers in the way that it would be theoretically expected to, these studies have relied mostly on European American or European samples. And the role of sociocultural contexts that might facilitate the benefits of support haven't really been studied. So for this reason, examining the possibility of Latino convivial collectivist contexts, I think, is really important for understanding the full potential of social support and its buffering possibilities. So the hypothesis that we studied was that the benefits of perceived social support during a standardized acute laboratory stressor, meaning everybody exposed to the same kind of stressor, would be maximized in our Latino sample. The argument that sociocultural contexts that are characterized by this convivial collectivism might create affordances for the potential benefits of social support that should extend all the way to physiology. And so here was the hypothesized model. As you can see, again, familism isn't directly related, but familism, through its connections with social support, starts to have an impact on cortisol reactivity, and that our hypothesis was that Latino cultural background would moderate that relationship. So these data come from a larger study on culture, relationships, and health. It included 86 participants, Latino and non-Latino. And in this study, because we were specifically interested in studying these affordances for social support that we hypothesized were brought about by Latino culture, that was the focus of differentiating and maximizing the sample, since it gets pretty small if you look at the non-Latinos. So the majority of Latinos in the study were of Mexican heritage, and the non-Latino group was primarily made up of people of European and East Asian heritage. 56 women, 30 men, mean age of about 20. And and I should note that of these groups, the sample was predominantly first generation, defined as being born outside of children of the first generation, defined as being born outside of the United States, and second generation. So first and second generation Americans of Latino background and of Asian background were the folks that were in this study. So participants were recruited from a large public university. They completed measures of familism. They completed measures of perceived social support. And then they took part in a task called the TSST. What is the TSST? The TSST is the Trier Social Stress Test. The Trier Social Stress Test is a reliable elicitor of cortisol reactivity that consists of a 3-minute preparation period, a 5-minute speech task, and then a 5-minute mental arithmetic task that takes place in front of 2 neutral and non-supportive observers. It looks something like this. Participants are asked to stand at a marked spot, and they're shown readily visible video recording equipment. They're told that experts that are trained in observing and analyzing behavior will later examine the video recording. And for the speech task, participants are instructed to imagine that they're applying for a job of their choice. And they're asked to describe the personal qualities that they would bring to the position. Personal qualities, not skills. Participants are allowed to speak freely, but then when they've remained silent for more than 5 seconds, the first neutral observer says, "You still have more time." For the math task, participants are instructed to serially subtract the number 13 from starting with the number 1027, and to do so as quickly as possible without making a mistake. When they make a mistake, as almost inevitably happens, then the second observer interrupts participants and directs that they start over from the beginning. So as I said, a reliable way of eliciting stress in the laboratory. Saliva samples are collected during the TSST. And so in this case, we followed a protocol where a saliva sample, which is taken through a sterile cotton salivette that you put under your tongue until it's really soaked with your saliva for analysis later, 1 minute before the task, and then 1 minute after the task, and then 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, all the way until 90 minutes after the task, in order to get an assessment and analysis of whether cortisol does what we expect it to do. Remember, we talked about how an adaptive and favorable cortisol response is to go up in response to acute stress and to then come back down. That's adaptive and healthy. So in this study, what we found here are the descriptives. And what I want to call your attention to is these correlational pieces where familism in the Latino sample was linked with perceived social support. And in the non-Latino sample, it doesn't seem to be. So that's what I want to call your attention to for a bit. And this is very important. Some of you may be thinking about this. So is there any difference in the cortisol trajectories across the ethnic groups? And the answer is no. There's no difference across the ethnic groups in cortisol trajectories. Even when I separated out the non-Latinos into European American and East Asian American samples, everyone goes up and everyone goes down. There are no significant differences across the groups. But when we tested the hypothesized model, when we asked the question of, is familism linked with support? And then in that context, is support related to this cortisol reactivity, the mean cortisol increase? Then we found support for the hypothesized pattern in the Latino sample. So familism linking with social support and being linked with a lower mean cortisol increase. So not this exaggeratedly strong response. And that was true in the Latino sample. We did not find the same pattern in the non-Latino sample. In the non-Latino sample, familism wasn't related to the sense of perceived social support. And interestingly, in this study, perceived social support for the non-Latino group was actually linked with a higher mean cortisol increase. So really different patterns that we were finding for the groups in this study. So the conclusion from the study is that, hey, familism, which I told you was originally studied as a deficit, as something to be changed about gente Latina, is actually an indirect buffer. It indirectly buffered cortisol responses via its association with perceived social support. And by that understanding, this means that familism and cultural values like it have implications for physiological processes that are relevant for future physical health. So our findings provide evidence that perceived support can buffer the physiological consequences of stress, and that it could be that we just haven't really studied this process in cultural contexts in which there is an affordance for social support. So this provides some of the first empirical evidence, I think the first empirical evidence, that the cultural value of familism can enhance the positive impact of social support linked to physiological processes that are implicated in health. And together, these findings contribute to a better understanding of factors that can maximize the potential benefits of social support. All right, so as I turn to the last study that I want to share with you today, I want us to think about how another feature of the social environment that is really relevant to culture is how much space does one have to have more than one culture. At a very abstract level, we all partake of more than one cultural environment, but especially for ethnic minorities, especially for people of recent immigrant heritage, and especially for people whose ethnic or racial backgrounds are stigmatized, it's not always so easy to have more than one culture and feel good about it. How do people who are biculturals negotiate those possible tensions from having more than one identity? And the psychologist Veronica Benet-Martinez and colleagues have been thinking about this, and they've developed a construct that they call bicultural identity integration, BII. And they think about BII as an individual difference, meaning some people are higher and some people are lower, and it just varies across people. It's an individual difference in the way that biculturals experience their two identities. So two ways that you can experience your cultural identities are as either compatible and integrated, i.e., they would say that you're high in cultural harmony. You see the two as coming together, as fitting well and as not being different from each other. Or you might see your bicultural identity as having more an oppositional or a conflicted, compartmentalized sense of self. So instead of seeing your two identities come together, you feel that they're in conflict with each other, that they're oppositional, and you have difficulty with putting together the two senses of self. So you might say, for example, that you feel torn between your one cultural identity and your other. Whereas opposed to during cultural harmony, you might feel like it's easy to balance both, one side and the other. So let me give you an example from my own life. So I'm Mexican American. I'm first generation or second generation. My parents were immigrants and I'm the first born in the United States. And in my family, soccer is huge, right? Football is what we call it. So when the US and the Mexico national teams play together, as you can imagine, it's a moment when your bicultural identity is like really salient. And I have these memories of watching these games and finding it to be like super stressful. I usually think of myself as having like a really culturally harmonious, I feel good about both sides. But in this moment, in these soccer games, oh, it just feels like no matter what happens, like I feel terrible and we're losing. And I remember talking about this with my father, who at the time was like, what are you talking about? Either way, we win. And he was clearly a little bit more harmonious about his two identities than I was. But that's the way to understand bicultural identity integration. So the hypothesis that we came into with this study is, hey, is there a link between how good you feel about your two identities and cortisol reactivity? And if so, in what direction would that be? So the thinking was that BII cultural harmony would be associated with perceived stress and with cortisol reactivity, and that this would be consistent with this broad pattern in the acculturation literature that suggests that our sense of perceived stress and also our cortisol reactivity, our perceived stress becomes higher with more time in the United States, with more acculturation, and our cortisol reactivity patterns become less favorable with more higher increases and slower recovery with more time in the United States, with more US acculturation. So in this study, we had 127 participants, women and men of Latino background, of non-Latino background, and we had them complete measures of the bicultural identity integration. They completed measures of perceived stress, and they again took part in that TSST task that I just showed you in the previous study. And this time the question we were asking was, is bicultural identity integration, the cultural harmony element of it, is it associated with perceived stress? And we asked this question in the full sample and found that cultural harmony was linked, feeling good about those two sides of your culture, was linked with less perceived stress. That was true for the full sample. It was true for the US-born sample. It was true for our foreign-born sample. It was true amongst our Latinos in the sample, and it was true amongst our non-Latinos in the sample. So overall, being able to feel good about your two identities was associated with feeling less stressed. Was cultural harmony, this bicultural cultural harmony, associated with cortisol responses? So here we again looked at this mean increase of like how much does your cortisol go up, and we don't want it to go up too much, right? Some is good and not too much. And what we found here, and what you see, is that those who were higher in cultural harmony had a more favorable cortisol reactivity response to the TSST, so that there was a negative and consistent link of not being quite as high in terms of your cortisol reactivity when you had a more integrated, culturally harmonious bicultural identity. So the conclusion here is that being able to smoothly integrate cultures affects our sense of perceived stress, and it affects our salivary cortisol strategies following acute stress. So true overall, true for the Latinos, who were the majority of the sample, and whose affordance from having a good bicultural, culturally harmonious identity has been severely tested by the sociocultural environment regularly, sometimes severely, over the last few years. So now we're nearing toward the end of my talk, and I just want to share that there's additional work that has been coming out of my lab, and that's in collaboration with other valued collaborators that have focused more on like what happens with people in the midst of managing when health goes wrong. And so in multidisciplinary teams that include surgeons, psychologists, cultural specialists, psychologists like myself, we have come together to engage in work that brings in stakeholders from our communities, community-based participatory research that brings in folks who can help us to understand what kinds of health problems they're facing and how we can create, take our understanding to create good interventions. And so with one of my colleagues, for example, we've done some work on an intervention that she calls relational savoring, where you emphasize positive emotion, and that helps us to engage in better relational processes, for example, between parents and children. And these kinds of interventions have been found to be particularly culturally congruent with immigrant Latinas, and that's what we're finding. And I'm also engaging these days in recent studies that are finding evidence that familism can be high in non-Latinos, African Americans, European Americans. There's just under certain conditions where familism values are about as high as they are in foreign-born Latinos, who typically have the highest levels of familism. And we also have at least one study where we're finding that non-Latinos who report not US acculturation, but non-Latinos who report being acculturated to Latino culture, i.e. speaking Spanish, watching Spanish language television, listening to music, having Latino friends, that's also linked with feeling more socially supported. So what are the overall conclusions and take-home messages of this talk? One, I hope you're coming away with a strong sense that culture shapes relationship processes, that culture has many flavors, and that these group-based solutions to the challenges of human social life, these filters through which our thoughts and behaviors pass as they become part of our subjective experience, the social maps that allow us to navigate rules, norms, and expectations, it's a force. It has many flavors, and we need to be really thoughtful about the cultural specifics, right? And if we're really thoughtful about that, we can start to see that culture can confer resilience. And for Latinos whose ways of doing relationships have all too often been studied as deficits, right? I told you that familism was originally studied as a deficit and something to be made different on your way to bettering yourself. Turns out, data says, could be a source of resilience, and it's something that we do all right, and that others, when they pick it up, also do all right. So I want to then conclude by saying gracias to you for listening to me today, saying gracias to my co-authors and to my laboratory and my funders. And so that ends my talk. And I think now I'll pass it on to Charlene, who's going to curate some questions for us.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Campos. We have so many of you saying, so interesting. Are you going to have a video? Can we listen to this again? So,
oh dear.
I knew when I ran across your research that this would be so relevant in our community, especially here in the San Francisco Bay Area, but in California. Look at all the hearts. I love that. Because our population really mirrors what you're seeing. You know, in our schools here, at least in Silicon Valley, we're pretty much 50% Latino. So the question is, given that your research shows the importance of cultures and honoring collective cultures, we just don't see teaching of the values so much in our schools and homes. What do you say about that, and how can we change it?
Yeah, no, I think that's the key question. I know that when I teach my undergraduate classes, one of the ways that I introduce this discussion about familism is I ask my students, well, how many of you at some point in your K through 12 experience were told that you need to be more separate from your family, that you need to be able to get away from them a little bit and not let them hold you back, yada, yada, yada. And to my dismay, there's still too many students who raise their hands and say, oh yeah, I heard that message and I got that message. And I guess I feel, you know, as a researcher, that the first antidote to that is to show the data and to indicate that that is not true, that that is wrong, to make sure that the young people listening to these messages and that the people teaching them these messages are also clear that like that's not what the data say. So if we have ideas about this separation and this independence being the only way to do things right, it's one of many ways to do things right. And interdependence that emphasizes these tight-knit family relationships can be one of the many good ways to do these things. So I think that raising awareness, as you're doing here by inviting me to this conversation, is a big part of moving things forward. And I think the data are really compelling. One thing that I didn't mention is, because it's not my work, but there was recently in psychology a wonderful meta-analysis that has come out of like 127 studies that have asked this question of whether familism is linked with more favorable mental health in young Latinos. And the answer is yes, it is. And so I think that we absolutely need to raise awareness of this issue. And I think in raising awareness of it, we will come to have hopefully students who don't experience this pushback about their ways of being in the K through 12 system. And I think, I don't know, I always have the feeling when I give this talk that somewhere, you know, my mom is thinking, but I told you, because this is what she was telling me when I was young, right? That this is the right way to be. And I was like, I don't know, man, I'm seeing a lot of things on TV. I'm hearing different things in school, but I think she was right. And I think we need to raise awareness about this.
I couldn't agree more, again, Belinda. And I keep thinking about if we could in our schools, especially with high Latino populations, honor somehow this research, this idea that collectivism is healthy for relationships and your body and all of that, things would be so much better, right?
Could be, yeah.
Could be. Do you have any ideas of ways to do that in groups that are not collectivists, like in a school setting or a home setting? Say we really want our kids to be exposed. What would you say? What should parents do? What should families do?
So I've been thinking about this a lot because I've been invited to be part of conversations that are thinking about this in school systems. And one of the things that comes to mind is to possibly have either trainings for school staff to be able to put together learning experiences for the children that emphasize learning cultural strengths. And so one of the things that we do at the university level is that when I teach my class, for example, and we're learning about these things, I actually have a class session where I invite my students to bring in a parent. And so bring in and have that intergenerational conversation about these ways of doing things so that you can facilitate this cultural conversation and kind of see these ways of doing things, or talk about a time when it was like really good to think about, you know, family this way or family that way. So I think like having events that maybe share like these moments where we're talking about our family relationships and how they go well, I think that could be part of the solution. But I mean, otherwise, I would love to hear other ideas from the audience, but I'm a researcher. So I think that, you know, the key thing is to make the findings known, is to make sure that these data are getting filtered down into knowledge for everybody, so that people have a more instinctive respect for this way of doing relationships, rather than thinking that independent is the only way to go in terms of relationships.
Exactly. You know, my co-founder and I are both developmental educators. So we've studied psychology and human development, and we run across someone like you and we think, okay, maybe this is a bigger box than typical parent education, but we think it's really important to bring ideas like yours so that people can consider how to integrate. I think about, for example, at Menlo Atherton High School, one of our local schools, they have a large Tongan population on the football team, and they started doing the haka dance at the beginning of
Oh,
every
yeah.
game. And now it's a tradition, and it's
Oh, I love
just so
that.
cool to see all the families and communities together doing that.
Charlene, that's like a wonderful example. So I think that sparks interest. And it reminds me of how one of my favorite research studies on this topic showed that when you spark interest in other people's culture, that gets you halfway to having like a better understanding, and leads to a greater openness to understanding about the various ways that folks do stuff in a way that is like sort of in a way that is respectful, in a way that helps us to all see the virtues of these different cultural ways of doing things.
Absolutely. I think I was there one day at a club rush day at the high schools.
Yeah.
And as a flash mob, they had the haka dance. So football players from all over the campus all came together and did that.
That's
and
amazing.
It was like, again, at a cultural event, club day. It was just so cool.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Other things that I think might be things that people could do based on interventions that I've seen is to watch films together. Storytelling is so compelling in terms of communicating different cultural ways of doing things and having respect for different cultural ways of doing things. So I'm thinking about showing maybe some films that highlight different ways of doing things and having people talk about them, or bringing in the adults, so parents and children, to come and talk about that. I think that might be particularly important when you have immigrant parents and children who are born in the United States, who might be getting these messages from the broader culture that their way of doing things isn't right. I think if they can watch films together and talk about it, and maybe they might start to come to see, find a more mutual understanding and a greater respect for these different cultural ways of doing things.
Absolutely. And you mentioned parents. We have a colleague who is a college admissions advisor who is Mexican American, and she brings her mom to events. And her mother talks about the messaging that she gave her daughter, got her on that pathway. And I just think that's such a powerful thing to do.
That is so powerful. I love it. I love the idea of a panel of moms talking about their journeys and sharing it with others. I know that in my own experience, that when my parents were able to talk to other parents about the experience of sending your child away to college, that I think it was really helpful for the parents on the other side. But to hear, you know, people talking to each other about these different ways of doing things and finding the virtue in all of them, because everything has pros and cons, right? And making sure that there is this respect, I think, for ways of doing things that hasn't always been historically evident, but that I think I hear that we're making strides to do so. And I hear that in the examples that you're giving, and I see that to some degree here. And so I think we're making progress, and hopefully we'll continue to do so.
I think so too. We did a talk about a week ago on the power of quiet leadership about introverts. And it turns out that many more kids are quiet, and teachers, parents, educators, we need to be aware, right?
Yeah.
Those cultural differences in how kids bring themselves to school.
That's right. That's right. And how they're encouraged to be in school and what it means to be respectful in school. And so, yeah. So I think you're doing the right work, Charlene. I feel like raising awareness, right? I feel like those of us in the lab are trying to tease apart and figure out some of the details. And then I think the next stage of the work is making sure that that's known, right? making sure that that's known in a way that like then teachers can think about like, okay, if I have a child who's more quiet, if I have a child who's more introverted, like how can I be responsive to their learning needs, right? One of the
Yes.
things,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
one of the things that I put into practice in my own classes is, and I don't call on people.
You don't.
I don't. Like I used to a long time ago because I thought, yeah, it doesn't bother me. I didn't think it bothered anybody, but that doesn't turn out to be right. And I read this very influential article about how, particularly in East Asian background families, how students are not necessarily socialized into like wanting to be the center of attention and responding in this way. So, and there was some really compelling, a study that I remember that showed that when you call on somebody and they're members of groups who have been socialized in this way, that you're actually impeding their performance rather than giving them an opportunity to like perform at their highest level. And so after that, I don't. I try to watch the nonverbals carefully so that I can see like who looks like they want to say something and who looks like they want to talk, and to encourage like outside of class to say to somebody maybe, hey, you know, if you want to say something, or your thoughts are so good when you write, you know, the journal or the paper that if you wanted to share it with folks, it would just be really, really great if you wanted to share it in class. So I want to encourage, but I don't call on folks.
Well, that really hit a chord with people.
Oh,
Such an important difference.
That must be all the introverts in the audience.
Turns out there's lots.
Yeah.
So Dr. Campos, our time together is coming to an end, but I want to end by asking you the question. Certainly there are many problems in our society in the United States today, but given your research and what you do, what gives you hope?
That's such a good question. I think hope is a little bit hard to find these days for
It
all
is.
of us. Yeah. I think I take heart in two things. That one, things have been difficult in the past and we find a way to move forward. So I think that there's that. And then I still believe in the optimism of and the adaptability of youth and of families. And I don't know, I guess I'm a sap and I believe in love. And I think that what love and what prioritizing others before the self makes us do, and what the data very compellingly show, is that they take us out of ourselves so that we're focused on the needs of others. And when we can do that, then we start to see our way to collective kinds of action or doing things for others in a way that benefits relationships and benefits societies.
That was beautiful. Dr. Belinda Campos, thank you so much today for an incredibly thought-provoking and interesting presentation. Thank you, everybody who's been with us, and all the hearts and all the love. We knew that this would be wonderful, and Dr. Campos, it was really, really an honor having you today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, Charlene. I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to the feedback that this brings to you.
This is more floating hearts than we've ever had.
What? It's amazing.
Thank you. Well, we hope to see you again soon, and thank you for taking the time tonight. It was a great honor.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.